So Star versus the Forces of Evil is a thing. Geez, that name is a mouthful. But despite the long name, the show is an absolute class act cartoon combining a fantastic overarching plot with lovable side characters, mysterious villains, and an exceptionally well-told love story. I first caught this show in 2017 when a friend told me that the story was really starting to get cooking. We were both big fans of Gravity Falls, and we were looking for something to capture that quirky adventure feeling while promising a larger story or mystery. This would have been around the show's second or third season. And he was right. The episodic nature of the show started to give way to an overarching narrative and pushed the lore, world building, and relationships. The show seemed to be casting off its basic storytelling structure in favor of a much deeper story. The themes too were moving beyond fun interdimensional romps and morality plays into an epic thematic narrative. You can tell these things got more epic when they started switching the ending song from goofy and low key, I think Earth is a pretty great place, to way more heroic and confident. She's a princess winning battle. And it stayed heroic and confident. By the time season 3 rolled around, Star versus the Forces of Evil, or maybe just SVTFOE, had ascended to one of my favorite TV shows of all time. Season 4 offered some incredible moments, and even though the last few episodes felt a little rushed, I blame Disney, the show stuck the landing. As I recall, the finale aired the same week or around the same time as Game of Thrones, so while everyone was moaning about that, I was thrilled with the ending of SVTFOE. Yeah, I don't think that short form's gonna fly. I think just Star for short, and I'll make sure to delineate between the character and the show. The show even stands up to rewatch. The first season is a little slow, but once it picks up around season 2, it was just as epic as I remembered. There were details I caught on the rewatch that I wouldn't know to look for the first time, but were very satisfying to pick up on. Aside from these details, I also noticed something very interesting about the themes of the show, and in particular about Star's arc in the show. As slow as the first season is, it's also incredibly important to how later seasons unfold and to how Star grows as a character, because Star the show is actually an incredible allegory for post-colonialism. No, I'm not just saying that because it's a trendy buzzword. The show has an amazing narrative of friendship, love, adventure, and finding your identity. Not just for Star and Marco, but also for Tom, River, Kelly, Moon, Eclipsa, Ludo, and even Jackie Lynn to some extent. But there is an underlying theme that is playing throughout the show that is about the after effects of colonialism. The show highlights this theme through Star's character growth across the show, the way history and memory are depicted and contrasted throughout the show, and the way Star has to come to grips with and decolonialize her own way of thinking. So while this is a children's show, or possibly a young teenage show, it doesn't pull any punches, and it's kind of incredibly brilliant in its execution of its post-colonialist themes. And so today, I want to talk about Star versus the Forces of Evil. Darren Nefsey had always been interested in strong female characters, but in the early 80s, they were not particularly abundant in American cartoons, so she found herself drawn to the cartoons and animation from Japan. Being a child of the 80s meant that the two anime shows that were easiest to find were Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball Z. Or Dragon Ball Z? I don't know, I'm Canadian. These shows had a profound effect on Nefsey's formative years. In college, Nefsey studied animation, where she pitched an original show to Cartoon Network, who were actively looking for new talent and ideas to foster. The original idea for the show featured two young characters, a young girl obsessed with Sailor Moon and magical girls, and a young boy likewise enamored with Dragon Ball Z, and the two of them were rivals on the playground, and antics and hijinks would ensue. Jananigans! The characters did not actually have magic, and were meant to reflect the obsession with magic powers that Nefsey had when she was in grade 4. Unfortunately, the project was not selected by Cartoon Network, but Nefsey reworked the show by aging the characters up. A few years later, she began pitching the idea to Disney, who suggested that the young girl should actually have magic. Nefsey liked the suggestion and began to flesh out a wider world in which Princess Star Butterfly would exist, and how her status as a princess and the implications of magic would influence her life. Marco was changed to complement Star, becoming more safety conscious rather than brash, but he kept his karate moves as a nod to his Dragon Ball Z inspiration. And the show also includes the voice actor for Goku.
Jana likes pink and fights the patriarchy.
Each 11-minute episode took about 6 weeks to storyboard before being sent off to animation, which is also a lengthy process. The first season premiered in 2015 and was received positively, but it wasn't the outright hit that Gravity Falls had been before it. However, subsequent seasons proved that the show was more than just entertaining. It was capable of telling thematic and compelling narratives. In 2019, it was announced that the 4th season of Star would be the last season. Based on how rushed these last few episodes are, I have a feeling that the showrunners were expecting at least another season, and Disney fucked them over. Still, 4 is better than Disney's usual 3 seasons. In June of 2019, the show came to a close. And since it's only been 6 years, Disney hasn't threatened to reboot it. Yet. Before diving into the reasons why I think Star is about post-colonialism and colonialist issues, a quick overview of the story is in order. So in case you haven't seen the show, this is your spoiler warning. The show begins with a somewhat rebellious but mostly just ADHD-addled Princess Star Butterfly hating her life as a princess and all the responsibility that comes with it. On her 14th birthday, Star is given her mother's magic wand, which has been passed down through generations of queens in the royal family. Unfortunately, Star seems to have her own brand of magic and is mostly a menace.
Rainbow Diaper Blast!
In an effort to teach her discipline, King River and Queen Moon send Star to live on Earth as an exchange student. Here, Star lives with the safety-conscious karate student Marco Diaz and his parents, who are weirdly unfazed by Star's attitude or magic.
Well, they are really cute.
Marco and Star become fast friends and begin to get into all sorts of hijinks. Some of them are as simple as Star adjusting to life on Earth, and others are fighting off the interdimensional monster Ludo, who's bent on stealing the magic from Star's wand. And sometimes episodes get really weird, as Star experiences deeper kinds of magic.
I think I'm going through puberty.
Tired of getting his ass handed to him by rainbow-colored water-dwelling mammals,
Mega Neural Blast!
and a 14-year-old karate student, Ludo seeks the help from a strange lizard in a suit.
Toffee. I guess his name is Toffee.
Eventually, Toffee manages to kidnap Marco, and Star must sacrifice her wand and magic to save him, which works, but her wand reforms, although it seems to be missing half of its core. Ludo finds the other half of the wand's core and creates his own wand, fashioned from a hand with a missing finger. And this wand begins whispering to Ludo as he tries to learn magic. Star is also trying to get better at magic from this book of spells and its keeper Glossaric. Glossaric attempts to teach Star how to find more powerful magic by dipping deep.
Okay, look, you can do magic without your wand. You just have to dip down, you know? Dip down. Dip down.
Star also finds a forbidden chapter in this book written by her ancestor, Queen Eclipsa. Meanwhile, a group of people called the Magic High Commission are trying to figure out why magic all over the multiverse has gone haywire. It probably has something to do with the fact that Star broke the wand, but Queen Moon is too afraid to tell the commission. To try and fix her wand, Star goes inside of it to try and find the thing that doesn't belong. Here she sees the legacy of her ancestors written in tapestry. It includes her mother, who had to take up the throne at a young age after her own mother was killed by monsters. It also includes Queen Solaria, who is the greatest monster hunter of them all, and the Dark Queen Eclipsa. It turns out that the thing that doesn't belong in the wand is a finger belonging to Toffee. This is the same finger that's missing from Ludo's new wand. Moon had made a deal with the imprisoned Eclipsa for a spell to defeat Toffee in exchange for freedom, but then Moon went back on her word because Eclipsa was evil. But this doesn't sit well with Star, who is struggling with her feelings towards Marco, but also her feelings about being royalty and having magic. The more Star spends time with Eclipsa, the more she feels something is off, especially when Eclipsa mentions her daughter Meteora. Meteora turns out to have been replaced by a peasant girl, and Star learns that she isn't actually even a princess. Moreover, she and Marco have a falling out of sorts, and she finds herself spending a lot of time with her friend Tom. The more Star tries to make things right, the more frustrated she gets with her relationships with her mother, with Marco, with the people and monsters of Muni, and with Queen Eclipsa, who turns out is not evil, she's just married to a monster, and people hated her for that. So much so that Moon decides Eclipsa is bad for Muni, and attempts to destroy Eclipsa with a giant insane magical warrior who goes rogue and tries to kill everyone anyway. In order to save everything she loves, Star decides to destroy all of the magic, even if it means never seeing Marco again, as he will be sent back to his own dimension. But the destruction of magic causes a convergence, and all of the multiverses crash together into one dimension where everyone lives, and Star and Marco are reunited. Much to Star's chagrin, her parents' plan of sending her to Earth to learn responsibility did actually work out, in a roundabout way. Despite the fact that Star basically ignored their rules about staying on Earth and often went to other dimensions to hang out with Princess Ponyhead, by the end of the story, Star has become this self-possessed, incredibly passionate and responsible young woman. So responsible that she is willing to sacrifice magic, which has been a huge part of her self-expression and the reason she was able to meet her best friend and be with her now romantic partner Marco, as well as the whole reason her friend Glossaric exists. She gets rid of the magic for a number of reasons, but her character arc and relationships showcase them brilliantly. From the very first episode, we see that Star is incredibly brave, but that she lacks discipline and is ignorant to the way things work. At the end of this episode, we see Marco and Star bond over their mutual respect for the way they each dispatch the monsters that have come after Star's wand. This is great, as it shows how competent the two of them are and how they respect each other. It also shows how each of them present themselves in their defensive and offensive styles. Star obviously has her flamboyant magic style.
Mega Mushroom Destruction Blast!
And Marco might be overly cautious, but he doesn't get his nickname for nothing.
She is talking about Karate Boy.
But what this episode shows is both Star and Marco's ignorance towards much larger problems, and very cheekily, it presents this to the audience in the form of tropes, which makes the audience complicit to their ignorance. Marco and Star defeat the monsters in order to defend Star's magic wand. In their eyes, this is all that matters, and we, the audience, understand that Star is good and monsters are bad. But this isn't really the case at all. At no point in the beginning do Star or Marco, and by extension the audience, ask why Ludo wants the wand and why the monsters seem to follow him. Compare that to later seasons where Star is not only a year older, but is friends with a monster.
Hello, Star Butterfly!
Hi, Buffrog!
Of course, how Star changes is motivated by the things she experiences, and as she experiences these things, we the audience also see her empathy start to unfold. Star experiences discrimination for being different, but she handles this with probably way too much confidence. But we also see her make tough decisions. When Mina Loveberry first shows up, this is Star's hero, but she's also a little unhinged. Star must choose to do the right thing, and this kind of thing happens over and over again. Once Ludo and Toffee are defeated the first time, Star begins to ask questions about why monsters are after her magic wand and what the magic means. Ludo also goes through this incredible change where he has to learn to become self-possessed and let go of his obsession with the wand. That he isn't really powerless, but actually incredibly resourceful and resilient. And this is one of the biggest losses in rushing the last couple episodes. It would have been really powerful if Ludo had more of a hand in destroying the magic and defending monsters as a part of his redemption and rehabilitation. By the time the end of the story rolls around, Star understands that not only were monsters treated unfairly, but that Toffee, in his weird and twisted way, was kind of correct in the way that humans had used and abused the power that came with magic. Hopefully, we the audience have followed along with this and can see why Star is correct in the way that she treats people and attempts to enact proper justice. She gives up her wand and the magic that comes with it, but remains a princess in other ways because she takes up the responsibility of helping Eclipsa despite her monster husband and half-monster daughter. And she does this in direct opposition to her mother, Queen Moon, and her former hero, Mina Loveberry. By following Star's arc, a narrative unfolds that teaches us about ignorance and why asking questions matters, and why that comes with a certain amount of responsibility, especially when wielding power, whether that be forceful power in the magic, class power in being royalty, or in just being born human, or whatever. But understanding this responsibility has a lot to do with understanding history. Star, the show, spends a lot of time on world building by showing the audience the past. It creates a vast and rich multiverse for audiences to experience and for characters to engage in. It's a crazy world out there with corporations,
attention quest by shoppers,
laundry monsters,
You're gonna wake it up.
and even time distortions.
My hot bod! Where did it go?
But while it's doing all this, it was also giving us a history lesson. The show presents the audience with two different histories. The one that the Mumins on Muni are taught and Star grows up with and begins to distrust, and we'll come back to this in the next section. And another history that only we the audience get to see all of. And maybe Glossaric because he's this weird interdimensional fourth wall breaking freak.
Anyway, see you around.
Is his voice different?
This unwritten history that only the audience is privy to is not unlike lost histories in the real world. These non-dominant and lost histories are called the subaltern. Sub as in lesser and altern as in alternative. Subaltern histories are the stories of peoples who do not get to write the history books. Most often they are the subjugated peoples who have had their own histories erased or neglected. Think of the way that the history of North America is often seen as only beginning with the arrival of white European colonists. Well, it's kind of the same for Muni, and this is where the show does things incredibly well. See, metaphors and analogies about race are often heavy-handed and do not work out super well. Like Zootopia and its issues with the fact that animals are behaviorally different from species to species. The more you think about that, the weirder it gets as an allegory for race. So instead, Star doesn't try to make its story about race per se, but instead about how colonialism creates a disparity between different peoples. And this metaphor still has its problems, but it doesn't attempt to do a one-to-one mapping. The subaltern in this case is the history that is given to the audience. Over the course of the show, we find out that underneath Marco and Star's favorite taco place is this secret portal to Muni, where Marco theorizes that humans traveled through this portal and became the first humans, hence the similarity in name. In the episode where Glossaric teaches Meteora how to dip deep, we discover a little bit more about the monster's fear of the magic, but also that Glossaric gave magic to the first humans, inadvertently giving them a great source of power with which they could create a class system of rule and royalty, and a means of oppressing the original inhabitants of Muni, which seems to be the monsters. These plot points are background minor things, and they're not even all in the same episode, because actually the Subaltern is always obscured by power and the creation of history, which is why Star has to unravel that history as both an uncovering of the truth and a decolonialization and unlearning of what she has been taught. I've already pointed out what the possible subaltern history of Muni looks like, but this is a very different history from the one that Star has been taught throughout her childhood, and it's this history that holds a kind of conspiracy of ignorance over the proceedings and conflicts in the later half of the show. In an early episode, Star has her friends help her reenact the day that Mumins won their independence by attacking monsters, and it's a cheeky episode which devolves into actual monsters showing up, and eventually Star coming to realize that maybe the way she was taught isn't completely accurate. As Star begins asking questions, she goes to Muni's monster expert only to find out that this batty old woman has no idea about anything to do with monsters. Even at the end, when she decides to live like a monster, she goes savage, which implies a gross ignorance of what monsters are like. Star then puts Buffrog in place as the new monster expert in an attempt to help monster relations, but the discrimination is a harsh truth for Star to learn, and Buffrog doesn't want to raise his children in a hostile environment and gives up the job. This is then compounded when we find out that the Magical High Commission opted to imprison Eclipsa and remove her daughter in place of a surrogate changeling. The reason they did this was because Eclipsa fell in love with and subsequently married a monster. For this, she was branded as the Dark or Evil Queen. That, and she has a penchant for gothic dress and weird spells, but we never held it against Star for expressing herself through her magic. Later on, Moon and River give up the castle and move to the woods, but as more Mumins become dissatisfied with Eclipsa because she treats monsters with respect, Moon opts to dethrone her. And yeah, Eclipsa is problematic, but a change in regime that comes with drastic changes in power structures, such as Eclipsa and her monster husband, will always cause anger amongst those who are forced to deal with their new position of equal power rather than privileged power. Why do you think so many men get mad about women doing literally anything?
I don't know how to respond to the shift in the paradigm.
Meanwhile, Star is caught in the middle, trying to teach Eclipsa how to rule and encouraging her parents and other Mumins to accept monsters. She cannot seem to understand why, when faced with overwhelming evidence that monsters are good, that some people remain steadfastly opposed to the idea. There is some progress. We see this in the Cornball episode, and Princess Spiderbite is even dating a monster, but there is an actual reason for this lack of understanding, just not rational. Earlier, I threw out the term a conspiracy of ignorance. Definitely one of my better phrases. But this was inspired by another term called white ignorance by a philosopher named Charles Mills. Mills came up with this idea to describe the way the world, but especially the United States, had created a society that was built on ignorance surrounding race as a result of history. It's a kind of great forgetting in which the accomplishments of today and the way that some people are more well off are caused by a kind of reframing of history, where those people who are worse off, i.e. people of color, are in that position because of their work ethic or lack of ambition, and not because of the long history of colonialist oppression and slavery that have affected them for generations and continue to affect them. This ignorance to the reality of the present society and the events that made society this way is why people in power, or those who benefit from the current social order, are under the impression that acts of racism and oppression are outliers rather than the daily norm that they are. Very importantly, one does not need to be white to have white ignorance ideology, nor does whiteness guarantee that someone will be white ignorant. But because white people benefit from the current social order and the history of colonialism that made it this way, they are less likely to see the power imbalance and therefore will be more likely to embody white ignorance, and will need to work harder to overcome how it affects their perception of the social order. Muni doesn't have a race problem to the same extent, but it does have a long history of oppression and colonialization. The use of magic is a kind of power that has created a false history for the Mumins. This has led to an ignorance or great forgetting about certain parts of history. For instance, when Moon uses that crazy magic spell on Toffee, she disperses the lizard people. For the Mumins, this is a great show of force, but for the monsters, this was a total act of inducing fear. A spell they could not regenerate from. This is a very different way of presenting history, but the Mumins don't think about this. They have their own way of presenting history, and it affects their perception of the present. It creates a false innocence amongst Mumins that they inherited their present social order through no wrongdoing of their ancestors, and that their outrage at monsters is justified because of what the monsters have done. Look at the way Star has to fight for Eclipsa to be given a fair trial simply because she was branded as a monster lover.
Due process, due process.
The same goes for the creation of the Solarian super soldiers. This is an army created for the express intention of destroying monsters and those who would harbor them. If you were a monster, you would be terrified of this. Of course, Moon justifies this as a means of trying to get rid of Eclipsa, who she sees as unfit to rule simply because there is a shift in power away from humans. While Moon cannot get over her prejudice due to white ignorance, she is what we would still call rational. Mina, on the other hand, has drunk the Kool-Aid. She is not rational, and she is shown to be off her rocker in more than one way. So to have Moon ally with someone who is so zealous about her cause, well, the writing was on the wall there. But it speaks to the way white ignorance, which appears to be a mild passive racism, can very easily become connected or encourage overt active racism. Or monstrous-ism. White ignorance is also pernicious because it can change based on the present needs of those who are in power. Tom and his family are literal demons, and yet they're not considered monsters.
And what about the Lucitors? I've seen Tom do some pretty scary stuff. Somehow he's not a monster. And Rich Pigeon? His kingdom is brand new. And he's a pigeon. With legs, mother!
White ignorance is more than just prejudice. It is a willful ignorance towards how the social order benefits some and oppresses others, and how certain historical narratives are propagated in order to maintain that ignorance. Because if the people in power believe they have done nothing wrong, then it's easy to paint others as the bad guys, or simply paint them as others. So people choose to live in this conspiracy of ignorance because it creates a blissful unawareness, and therefore no responsibility over how others are affected by it. And this conspiracy isn't just societal, but also lodged within the mind. Star has to come to grips with the fact that she is not better than the monsters. We watch her unlearn this prejudice and really grapple with the injustices surrounding how monsters are stereotyped, oppressed, and misunderstood to the point that in order to get a job, they're forced to work for people like Ludo to make a living.
We keep monsters out because monsters are dangerous. You know that.
Well, yeah. But no.
And using magic to change people's minds won't work. First of all, it's not ethical as we see Star call Eclipsa out for it.
How is anyone supposed to trust you if you use spells like that?
Secondly, and I think rightly, the use of power to change the outcome toward one person's favor is really what got Muni in this mess in the first place. So instead, Star opts to just outright destroy the magic. It wasn't just giving up her wand, but the removal of all magic, and by extension even the multiverse itself. But Star chooses to do this because she has overcome her own white ignorance. And it was a hard won and thankless job. It required decolonializing her thought process in order to see history as flawed. Now here's where the allegory inevitably falls apart. There is no real-world equivalent to destroying magic as a means of giving up and equalizing all power. Racial and colonialist power is embedded in the social order, and it isn't going anywhere just because a 15-year-old white girl says so. Much as I wish that were the case. Instead, the solution has to come about the same way it did for Star, through a proper examination of history that goes beyond what was systemically and systematically propagated, by looking at the subaltern and asking questions about other kinds of people. White ignorance is not just a system that propagates and perpetuates historical ignorance, but also a colonialist mindset, and changing that is an astronomical individual and societal task, one that even destroying magic probably didn't squash, as it was only a relinquishing of magic power and not social power. At the end of the show, all of the multiverses have crashed together, and this is going to be a hard place to live for a long time, because there's going to need to be a lot of introspection and getting over white ignorance, and that does not come easily. Honestly, I feel like that would have made a pretty good show in itself, if Disney's thinking about maybe doing a reboot. Season 5. This show is a wild ride. I loved the romance and love triangle between Star, Tom, and Marco, and the fact that Tom and Marco became really good friends despite all that happens between them. I love that this show is chock full of really amazing female characters who are really quirky, some a little nutty, and some are a little genocidal, but all of them were interesting. It was nice to see a show that treated all of its characters with respect. But the way the show presents the subaltern and how a long-standing history of oppression has led to a very twisted and one-sided version of events that has become a radical historical propaganda is straight up brilliant. And that's only one of the themes. The Princess Marco subplot does a lot with gender norms, and not to mention the way Meteora was forced to become Mrs. Heinous as a side effect of internalizing the hatred of monsters, especially the parts of herself that are monstrous, due to this historical education. And yeah, sure, maybe I'm probably digging into this a bit much, but it's not like it's a stretch. Post-colonialization and white ignorance have and continue to cause a lot of harm to the way the social order works out. Our society is not egalitarian, there are haves and have-nots, and who lands in which category has a lot to do with past events that are often willfully forgotten because it's easier for those in power not to have to think about it. This happens in real life all over the place. Go read up about the devastating rubber trade caused by the Belgian monarchy in the Republic of the Congo, or the way the United States government continues to belittle Haitian people without acknowledging that it is singularly responsible for undermining that country at every turn. This is history that did happen, but people in those countries don't know about them because of white ignorance and systematic historical propaganda. So how to undo these kinds of things? Well, empathy is important, and you can hear me talk more about that on this episode of Hilda, or Equestria Girls. Empathy is about seeing things from other people's points of view by doing things like, I don't know, going on an exchange to another school and living with another family. I don't think it's a coincidence that Star is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white girl and Marco is Hispanic. I think that would deeply affect how Star views prejudice. White ignorance is alive and well, and it permeates every part of our culture, especially in the West, and this show somehow managed to showcase its widespread effects in a rather spectacularly nuanced manner, both at the individual level of Star herself and from the social and political level of human society and royalty. And that is why Star vs. the Forces of Evil is a masterclass in understanding oppression and post-colonialism. Here are my stray thoughts. I love when Marco's dad calls the Sad Teen Hotline for Star and Tom. That's both a hilarious and really emotional character-driven episode. I know a lot of people really enjoy Jana, but I think she's just kind of mean to Marco a lot. Not my favorite. I love the way Star yells out Marco's name. Marco! I wish Luda was more important towards the end of the show. He was an amazing character, and who doesn't love Alan Tudyk? Is Rich Pigeon named that because he's wealthy, or is his first name Richard and that's just a short form? Hey, thanks so much for watching that video. I think it's very relevant to what's going on right now in the world, and I wasn't exactly particularly subtle about it. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, go ahead and give it a like or share it around with some of your friends, and make sure you're subscribed because I got way more ideas all coming down the pipeline right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.